Прежде всего, следует признать, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века.
The American dream is dead. If I get elected president, I will bring it back.
И что стало с теми заверениями, которые давались западными партнерами после распуска Варшавского договора? Где теперь эти заявления? О них даже никто не помнит.
We don't have victories anymore. We used to have victories, but we don't have them. When was the last time anybody saw us beating, let's say, China in a trade deal? They kill us.
Хочу сказать, что специальная военная операция идет в строгом соответствии с графиком, по плану.
Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done, so it should be easy.
I put together these quotes not to prove that Trump and Putin are identical politicians. What interests me is something else. Why did two completely different countries, with different histories, different political systems, different cultures, at some point choose the same type of leader? A leader who promises to restore lost greatness. And why did the script end up looking so similar too? First euphoria, then conflict, then disappointment. It's about why the same playbook keeps working and what this says about us. So, let's map this out. Both Trump and Putin build their media image around the archetype of the strong leader. The origins of their strongman vibes are obviously very different. Putin came to power as a modest bureaucratic figure, a former KGB officer, with the austerity associated with that background, but also with military discipline and an analytical demeanor. He also benefited from the contrast with his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, who was charismatic, but by that point was visibly aging, struggling with health problems and alcoholism.
Я ухожу.
Trump entered politics from business, but not as a serious technocrat in the style of someone like Michael Bloomberg. He entered as a media billionaire, a man who had spent decades selling the public an image of winning. His persona was built around discipline and public service, like Putin's, but around performative success, luxury and dominance. Skyscrapers with his own name on them, private jets, gold interiors, a model wife. A reality show where he literally fired people with the phrase,
You're fired. You're fired. You're fired.
if Putin's strongman archetype is the cold man of the system who came to restore order after the chaos of the 1990s, then Trump's is the alpha businessman who supposedly knows how to win in a world where everyone else is getting scammed. In any case, let's remember the first political maneuver that unites them. Both rely heavily on the image of the strong leader. Their power rests on personality, not institutions. That's why in their rhetoric, the state is almost always personalized. Not the administration did this or the system worked, but I made the deal, I stopped it, I restored respect for the country. Politics turns into the story of one man who supposedly can solve systemic problems single-handedly because he's smarter and more decisive than everyone else. Putin, by the way, handles this need to connect all positive developments in the country back to himself in a very interesting way, without explicitly saying I did this. Remember, his image is that of a modest bureaucratic operator, so instead of openly praising himself, he tends to say things like "it was done" or "a decision was made", and then the propaganda machine reframes it as "Putin did it". This idea grows very naturally out of the previous one. A strongman leader cannot simply govern the country. He constantly has to prove his exceptionalism to the audience. The country must appear to need saving. It's basically the Kaufman drama triangle in action, where the savior gradually turns into the persecutor. In Putin's case, the external enemy becomes NATO and the collective West, while the internal enemies are national traitors, the fifth column, and foreign agents. In Trump's case, the external enemies become China, globalists, disloyal allies, and countries that rip America off by exploiting American weakness for their own benefit. The internal enemies become corrupt elites, the deep state, universities, bureaucracy, and eventually, quite literally, the enemy from within. This maneuver, identifying internal and external enemies, also serves another extremely useful function. Because at some point, the electorate may start asking, if our leader is so strong, why hasn't he fixed everything yet, like he promised? And that's exactly where internal and external enemies become convenient. Because now the explanation is simple. They are preventing him from doing it. They are supposedly so insiders and omnipresent that they keep stopping the strong leader from simply taking the country into a brighter future. And if people eventually start getting tired of this endless and unproductive struggle against enemies, if approval ratings begin to slip, then it becomes time for the third maneuver, rally around the flag. Rally around the flag is a political science phenomenon where support for the national leader and government suddenly spikes during international crises, wars or external threats. And if we analyze Putin's approval ratings, the effect plays out almost exactly like a textbook example. You can see that after the global financial crisis of 2008, his approval rating starts slowly but consistently declining. And then the rally around the flag moment appears, that sharp spike in March 2014, during the wave of national euphoria after the annexation of Crimea. Then the pattern repeats itself. The graph starts gradually declining again, only this time even with the sharper drops after the Navalny protests in 2018 and COVID. And then, almost like a magic wand for the ratings, the beginning of the special military operation. And if seeing the graph start stubbornly sliding downward again by January 2026 gave you a vague feeling of anxiety, you are not alone. A lot of analysts noticed it too. Combined with the statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry claiming that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland are allegedly allowing Ukrainian drones to pass through their airspace, this becomes a genuinely worrying signal suggesting that Russian external aggression could eventually spread to them as well. But let's not dwell on dark predictions. We're here to compare the political maneuvers of Putin and Trump, so let's move on to the approval ratings of the American president. And this is where things get interesting. Trump's mechanism is similar, but it works much worse. If Putin's rally around the flag moments created almost vertical spikes in approval ratings, Crimea, the beginning of the full-scale war, Trump doesn't get the same effect even during military crisis. And the reason is pretty obvious. American society is now so polarized that even external threats no longer create moments of genuine national unity. For Trump supporters, military conflict can look like proof of strength. Finally, America is striking first again. Finally, people fear America again. Finally, nobody is pushing us around. But for his opponents, the exact same situation looks not like restored greatness, but like dangerous escalation, recklessness, and an attempt to distract from domestic problems. So I think Trump absolutely wanted a rally around the flag effect, but under current levels of polarization, all he really manages to achieve is mobilization of his own base. That's why neither Maduro's arrest nor the war with Iran radically transformed his approval ratings. And this is an important difference between an authoritarian system and a polarized democratic one. In Russia, state propaganda can very quickly turn war into a sacred narrative. We are fighting the entire West. They want to destroy us. There is no way back. In the United States, the exact same maneuver immediately gets thrown into the meat grinder of partisan warfare. Some see strength, others see a threat to democracy, and others just see another political spectacle. And this is not simply a personality trait of Putin or Trump as men who enjoy flattery, although Trump very obviously does enjoy it. This too is a consequence of the original decision to present themselves as strong leaders. We already discussed how the strongman leader constantly ends up in a fragile position because he promises that under him everything will finally become different, thanks to how decisive and unlike previous leaders he supposedly is. But usually things do not become different, or more accurately, they do become different, just not in the way he promised. And if such a leader surrounds himself with people who are smarter, brighter or more competent, then during moments of weakness, the electorate may suddenly start thinking a dangerous thought. If our current leader actually isn't strong enough to solve these problems alone, maybe this other person around him could. Their programs are similar, maybe it's simply the wrong man at the top. That's why criticism inside the circle of strongman leaders gets eliminated extremely quickly, voluntarily or forcibly, loudly or quietly. Only the people willing to sing in unison remain. It's no secret that Putin surrounded himself almost exclusively with either old friends from his judo club or security official from St. Petersburg. And what unites both groups is that none of them have independent political ambitions. Trump, meanwhile, entered politics promising to hire the best people. But it quickly became clear that in his system, the best people did not necessarily mean the most competent people, it meant the most loyal. And this becomes especially obvious when you compare his first and second terms. During the first term, Trump still had people around him from the traditional Republican establishment: generals, lawyers, bureaucrats, advisors, people who tried to fit him into a normal institutional framework. They could argue with him, slow things down, talk him out of decisions and filter his impulses. But for a strongman leader, those people are not protection against mistakes, they are a threat to the image. Because if someone inside the system can't tell the president no, then the president is not all-powerful. And if the president is not all-powerful, the entire performance of strength starts collapsing. James Mattis, John Bolton, Rex Tillerson, Mike Pence. Almost every person who tried to act as an independent political subject rather than a pure executor eventually found themselves pushed out of Trump's circle. And by the second term, the logic became much cleaner. The goal was no longer to have adults in the room, but people who already accepted that the room belonged to one person only. And the final stage of this self-sustaining cycle becomes the catalyst for the systemic failure. Mistakes continue accumulating. The strong leader cannot admit them, because doing so would destroy the image, or at least it seems that they themselves genuinely believe that. And meanwhile, there are no people left around them willing to point out that the emperor has no clothes. And that's why both of them end up doubling down on failed decisions while insisting that everything is going according to plan. Let me put my cards on the table right away. My goal here is not to prove that Putin is just a more evil version of Trump, or that Trump is following Putin's exact playbook, even though Trump himself openly admits he admires him. I fully understand that there are many differences between them, and we're about to go through the biggest ones. What surprises me is that despite all those differences, they still ended up having so much in common. So, the first and most important difference is the institutional context. Trump entered a system with 250 years of check and balances behind it. Courts blocked his executive orders. The press kept functioning and still does. And even though Trump quite obviously sees institutions as obstacles to his political genius and constantly tries to shake them, the institutions are still standing. Putin entered a system where stable and balanced institutions had barely had time to form. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the structure of power in Russia, just like in the other former Soviet republics, started transforming extremely fast. The Communist Party and the old Soviet nomenclatura, basically the ruling political elite, which periodically held a parliamentary majority, didn't want to give up power. That led to the shelling of the parliament in 1993, and it's also one of the reasons Yeltsin couldn't really afford to turn Russia into a parliamentary presidential republic. As a result, he left behind a number of vulnerabilities that Putin later exploited. This wasn't the only factor. I'm just trying to quickly sketch the difference between the two systems. Putin had a much easier time dismantling institutions in Russia. First, because he had time. Second, because those institutions were already fragile to begin with. Difference number 2. Control over media and opposition. One of the Putin's very first political moves after coming to power in 2000 was the takeover of NTV, the last major independent television network in Russia. By the mid-2000s, the Kremlin already controlled all federal TV channels. By the time the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, Russia's main opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, was already in prison. Later, he was killed. The remaining opposition forces failed to unite, and today the Russian government operates with almost shocking ideological uniformity. Thanks again to weak institutions, and I think partly to his KGB background, Putin managed to establish near total control over both the media and the opposition. Trump constantly calls CNN fake news, but CNN still exists. Opposition parties still function. People still protest in the streets. Again, the constant back-and-forth struggle between Republicans and Democrats, where power swings from one side to the other, actually makes the American system relatively resilient. And honestly, I think Trump probably would like to have the same level of control over the media and opposition that Putin has. They very obviously irritate him, but the political structure of his own country works against him. And there's another important thing. For Americans, the Constitution is basically a sacred document. If Trump's actions start too openly contradicting it, he risks losing support even among parts of his most loyal base. Difference number 3. Personal risk. At this point, Putin physically cannot leave office. After 2022, too much has accumulated around the Putin regime. Too many people harmed. Too many decisions that could never survive legal scrutiny. Losing power for him is no longer just political defeat, it's an existential threat. Trump lost the 2020 election, and despite trying to challenge the results, remained alive, wealthy and politically active. Yes, after leaving office he faced criminal investigations, and in many ways, winning a second term effectively gave him temporary immunity. But even that doesn't make losing power an existential threat on the same level as it becomes in personalist regimes. For Trump, losing power mostly means damage to his ego, influence, business interests and possibly legal exposure. But it's still not a situation where stepping down automatically threatens the physical survival of the entire system around him. For Putin, the system is him. Over 2 decades, Russia's political vertical became so personalized that the transition of power no longer looks like a normal political process, but like a potential collapse of the entire structure. Because too many people inside that structure depend on one another – security officials, oligarchs, bureaucrats, propagandists. And too much depends not on institutions, but on informal guarantees of loyalty and protection. That's why in authoritarian systems, leaders gradually become less and less able to afford losing. Not necessarily because they are personally obsessed with power, but because the system itself slowly turns stepping down into something dangerously risky. And in my opinion, Trump still hasn't crossed that threshold where a strongman can no longer afford to lose elections. But honestly, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts about that in the comments. So, we've gone through the similarities and differences between Trump and Putin, but we still haven't answered the main question. How did two completely different systems end up producing two surprisingly similar politicians at roughly the same time? I think there are four major structural conditions that, when combined, create a kind of market demand for a certain type of leader. Mechanism number 1. Crisis of trust in institutions. Remember when I talked about how post-Soviet Russia barely had time to develop stable democratic institutions? Now let's add the chaos of privatization in the 1990s. Privatization was the process of transitioning from a state-controlled economy to a market economy by selling off state-owned property to citizens. But because the transition had to happen so quickly, the process created an extremely unequal distribution of resources. Most people simply didn't have money to buy their share of state assets, while the people who did have the money became dramatically richer almost overnight. Then, in 1998, Russia defaulted, triggering a devastating economic crisis. And overall, I'd say that by the early 2000s, many Russians who were simultaneously trying to learn what democracy even was and how market economy functioned, developed a very specific perception of the state, something opaque, ideologically neutral, and therefore fundamentally unconcerned with fairness. Something that could take your resources away at any moment if it decided it needed them more than you did. And you can imagine how attractive Putin looked against this backdrop. He constantly presented himself as the man who came to restore order. He positioned himself against the oligarchs, and he promised to restore dignity to ordinary people. The American crisis of trust in institutions was much subtler, because democratic and market institutions in the US actually do function and have existed for a long time. People understand what they are for and can clearly see their effectiveness. But the 2008 financial crisis revealed who those institutions ultimately worked for. In 2008, the banks got rescued first, politicians kept their chairs, top executives got bonuses. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people lost their homes, their jobs, and their sense of stability. The second major blow to institutional trust in America came from the wars in the Middle East. Formerly, the American state apparatus looked incredibly powerful. Congress votes, administrations make decisions, generals give forecasts, experts explaining why everything is necessary for democracy and national security. But then years pass, Iraq is destabilized, Afghanistan ends in what is essentially a defeat, trillions of dollars are spent, thousands of people die. And the average American starts asking a very simple question. Wait, if all these smart people were running the country, why did the outcome turn out this catastrophic? And into that vacuum steps Trump. If Putin sold himself as the man who would restore the state after chaos, Trump sold himself as the man who would expose and punish the existing state for betraying ordinary people. Hence his constant language: drain the swamp, corrupt establishment, rigged system. Mechanism number 2. Crisis of trust in media as an entry point. Here you could actually say that Putin and Trump ended up in surprisingly similar situations. In both Russian and American society, distrust toward the media had been building up for years. And interestingly, for somewhat similar reasons. Major media conglomerates were controlled by elites, and after repeated economic crises, people increasingly started resenting those elites too. It began to feel like ordinary people were the only ones suffering during crisis, while the elites lived in some parallel reality. And the narratives promoted by major media existed mainly to preserve that balance of power. In Russia, the government managed to successfully popularize two ideas. First, liberal media are Western puppets. Second, truly independent media do not exist, because every media outlet is funded by someone, which means every media outlet depends on someone. And if it isn't funded by the state, then it must be pushing an anti-Russian agenda. It's not surprising that under those conditions, Putin managed to bring the media under state control with relatively little public resistance. But we already talked about that. What we haven't talked about is the very interesting maneuver Trump used to make the media work for him on his own way. Algorithms and the television rating model are optimized for engagement, and engagement equals emotion equals conflict. A leader who speaks calmly and with nuance loses to a leader who speaks simply and scandalously. And Trump fully exploited that advantage. He gave the media an endless stream of scandals, and they simply couldn't stop covering him because he was traffic. But in both cases, the core mechanism is the same. The strongman leader exploits distrust in traditional media in order to fill that vacuum with himself. Mechanism number 3. Economic inequality creates an audience for betrayal narratives. Besides generating distrust toward elites, economic crises also create a demand for a simple and emotionally convincing explanation for why everything went wrong in the first place. And there is probably no simpler and more effective explanation than "you were betrayed." This is exactly the fertile soil where narratives about internal and external enemies flourish so easily. In Putin's case, the narrative became liberals and the West looted Russia in the 1990s. In Trump's case, the elites shipped your jobs to China and Mexico. In both cases, the structure is identical. There is the real people, there are the traitors, and I am on your side. That explanation is much easier to sell than "the system is complicated and nobody specifically is to blame." Mechanism number 4. They're both products of the same historical era. The end of the Cold War created winners and losers inside every country. At the time, liberal democracy seemed inevitable and uncontested. Fukuyama's end of history and globalization as destiny became almost ideological common sense. The people who felt like they lost in this new order, in Russia basically most of the population, in America a more specific social class, became the audience for revanchist politics. Putin and Trump are both politicians of post-Cold War disillusionment. They both sell revenge, just to different audiences and with different content. And honestly, I think themselves genuinely believe in the mission they publicly describe, that institutions and media are slow, inefficient and ultimately obstacles, preventing a strong leader from bringing society to prosperity. The world changed dramatically, but Trump and Putin seem unwilling to fully accept those changes. Their worldview simply doesn't allow for the possibility that the old archetype of the tough guy who comes in and fixes everything himself has become outdated, even a little ridiculous. Which is understandable in a way. Almost all pre-21st century political and cultural mythology was built around exactly that figure. How could something so deeply rooted suddenly become obsolete in just 30 years? So in the end, all four mechanisms work together like a funnel. Crisis of trust creates demand. Media vacuum amplifies the signal. Betrayal narratives provide emotional anchoring. The historical moment shapes the form of revenge politics. A leader who knows how to work with all four gains a stable support base that cannot be dismantled with rational arguments alone, because that support is based not on facts, but on identity. So my point is this: Trump and Putin are not glitches in the system. They are not inevitable outcomes either. They are logical outcomes of the system and conditions that produced them. There's a temptation to think that once we understand the hardened mechanisms strongman politicians use, we'll somehow stop falling for the illusion they create. That's not true. Most people who vote for Putin know television lies and still watch it. Most people who vote for Trump know he exaggerates and still vote for him. Understanding the mechanism doesn't eliminate the emotional need that mechanism satisfies. And the need itself is simple: certainty in an uncertain world. An enemy you can name. A leader who says he knows what to do. Putin and Trump carry the fingerprints of their era, the era of post-Cold War disillusionment. The next generation of leaders will carry the fingerprints of ours. They'll talk about the collapse of globalization, AI destroying traditional professions, climate change, and a new multipolar world that will once again create winners and losers and people who want revenge. So why make this video at all? Not to create immunity, there's none. Not to become smarter than everyone else. That's actually a trap of superiority that often makes people more vulnerable, not less. But to learn how to see the system itself and not just the people inside it.